Alright, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the common errors that people do when they start to write a story and don't pay attention to what we call these key elements of fiction. Okay, this is what you get. The most common one is a self versus the self, and at first it sounds like a really great idea. Stories where you have a character who's really the worst enemy or the biggest obstacle is some aspect of himself. And we see three different ways in which this kind of story takes place. We have a character who spends most of his overtime in the tub thinking about the dilemmas of life. Or we have a character struggling internally against his instincts, his bad habits, his psychological problem, someone who drinks and can't stop drinking, etc. Or we have a character who observes the evils of society and ends up committing suicide, finding that there is no way to solve problems. It's not that there's anything wrong with these particular types of premises, but what happens when someone who first begins to write um, focuses on this kind of thing and neglects to provide an external objective or neglects to provide an external obstacle or enemy is the assumption that something that is external, like a desire or an object, has nothing to do with the character's personality. So you can resolve all that simply by having an inner conflict. But that's really not true. In stories, as I said before, every obstacle, every enemy, every opponent, an opponent doesn't have to be an enemy, it just has to be someone who is somehow standing in the way of the main character getting what he or she wants. All of these are really reflections of the character's inner life. And when you focus too much on the character's inner life, you have a story that really has no tension, that really sort of sits in the bathtub, to use a metaphor. It doesn't go anywhere. We want to see a character doing something. You wonder why you don't ever see people thinking about this in fiction, but if you were watching a TV show or a film where the whole time there's just some character thinking, doing nothing, after 10 minutes you'd turn it off. You wouldn't want to watch it. But it's really kind of the same thing in fiction. Don't get misled because some pieces of writing are very, very well construed. They have really strong prose in them. You still have to have all these other elements. We don't need to have exploding cars. We don't need to have cancers, fatal cancers. We don't need to have apocalyptic wars in fiction. There's plenty of good fiction that's written about much smaller things than that. But you do have to have some kind of external manifestation of the character's internal process. Otherwise, you're going to get stuck even in the writing. It's going to be really hard for you to get interested in what the character does next if there's nothing compelling pushing him or her forward. The next is people who write and get really fascinated by the victim. And the victim as a main character appears in different situations. The romance of the child, the helpless child who's born, Oliver Twist in a helpless, poor family, helpless to do anything but endure. Be very, very careful with this kind of story because it's very easy to get caught up in a very sentimental cycle where the only power of the story is in how much you can make your reader feel sorry for the child. And secondly, because children have so little power to act that you will end up having a story where most of the things happen to the character as opposed to the character acting towards something. Again, it could be a great idea for a story, but you would have to keep in mind that you would have to somehow make this child extraordinarily precocious, both in his or her observations and her ability to detect malice from other people, and also extraordinarily capable of acting beyond his circumstances. So that's why it's so hard to write a good story like this. Obviously, with Harry Potter and things like that, there's a way to do it, but think about what Harry Potter has. Harry Potter has all these stores of magic at his disposal, all these different mentors, the hawk, he has lots of helpers in order to overcome this idea of a helpless child, which is really the reality of most children. The next one is that the character is consistently beaten up by live people and circumstances and spends the entire story bemoaning her fate. A metaphor that I want to make here, if you have a really depressive, kind of, downer neighbor that maybe you visit because you feel sorry for him and you would like for him to feel better, chances are that you don't invite him to your party a whole lot. When you have your friends over, you don't want to have the downer there. Well, the short of this thing is that nobody loves a victim. Um, and another variation of this character is the character who suffers from severe handicaps, and through her mishaps, the reader experiences the terrible injustices of life. Once again, you're harping too much on the reader's sympathy. A little works really well, but if you do it too much and it becomes the focus of the story, you're just going to turn off your readers and it's not going to be interesting anymore, because ultimately it just will feel like emotional manipulation. So be very careful with this type of writing. The other is the counter of that, which is the superhero. And there are two types of superheroes, and sometimes they're combined into one. And the first is the main character has amazing abilities to destroy, detect, survive, fight. No matter what happens to his character, he always comes out okay. Somebody shoots a fireball at him, he always manages to be clever enough to, bring out a shield or something or other. It's what my students sometimes call a severe case of badassness. If you have too many badasses in your story, chances are there's not much that's going to happen, because there's not going to be enough conflict in the story for the reader to feel like there's anything at stake. We will know the ending before we even begin to read past the first chapter. And the second is the character is gifted with the ability to always make the correct decision, the right moral choice, the humane and appropriate thing. God, this character is infallible. And let's face it, nobody loves a bragger and nobody loves anyone who is perfect. The reason for reading fiction is because we all like to be transported into other worlds, seeing other people who are more like us and less like perfect things, and we want to see how they deal with this kind of situation. So a little bit better than us? Yeah, definitely. But too much of a perfect hero does not make for an interesting story. And finally, we can really kind of summarize two types of stories that don't really work that well. The first is the plot-driven with weak character development. And this type of story spends too much time developing blow-by-blow battle scenes. You'll have 3 pages of the deployment and the types of guns that they're carrying and the types of bullets, the training tactics, or the football story where we get the minute-by-minute football game description. All of this maybe work for a very select handful of people who are real aficionados of whatever it is you're writing, football, war, whatever. But most of us are just going to be bored because we'd rather watch a movie. If action is your main thing, then fiction is not the best medium to deliver just that. It has to be tempered with other things. And the other one is the opposite, is the character-driven plot with too little plot. Character-driven with too little plot. So this type of story focuses too much on the conundrums of the mind. It turns into long philosophical discourses, or has like pages and pages of people just having a conversation about what life is, or what God is, and things like that. And these are maybe interesting if they were written as nonfiction pieces and dissertations on the meaning of life or dissertations on God. But again, fiction is not a good medium for this, because if I'm going to do something like this, then yes, I'm going to read a philosophy book, or I'm going to read poetry or something that is inspiring and gives me something that's real. For fiction, since it's made up, I think it's not a very good way of using fiction. There are exceptions, of course, to every rule. There are people who have written books that were merely for the merit of expounding, but those were written by very capable writers who were able to do a lot of things beyond it. So, the last I said 2, I mean 3. So the last one is the experimental novel. Look what I can do is what I like to call this type of novels. And these are novels that people want to brag about how well they write, so they will have really strange sentences using very lyrical descriptions that essentially, instead of saying a wall, they will say perpendicular structure standing just a few feet ahead of them. And this kind of stuff is, it has a place. If you're a truly virtuous writer and you're really good at showcasing something like weirdness or humor, lyrical dexterity, yeah, there's a place for it, but it's not fiction. Fiction is really all about the story, and I like to say it's the story stupid. So try to stay away from just expressing your virtuosity, at least before you have learned to really deliver a story. If you can do both, you've got a winner. But until you get to that point, stick to the story. And finally, we have Nothing New, another Harry Potter Twilight Ring trilogy remake. And, these are the kind of people who would love to write a fantasy novel but end up just using the same characters or the same premise or the same setting as, say, Harry Potter or the Ring trilogy. It's not that you have to be completely original and reinvent the wheel every time you write in one of the genres. Obviously, the vampire genre has so established that you can't have a vampire who doesn't drink blood. You can't have a vampire who isn't affected by the sun. But you still have to figure out some way of bringing in a new insight. Otherwise, you're just wasting your time. Because it may be something fun for you to do with your friends, to read it, but in terms of the larger audience on a professional level, it's not going to be interesting to anyone unless you can bring something new to the game. So I would say, once again, if you're a real fan of mythology and you've studied it deeply and you think you can bring a new twist to it, go for it. But if not, resist the temptation to just go over the books that you love and rewrite the books that you love.